My friends, Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Mesechet Yevamos Daf Yud Ches. We're going to start on 17b, around 15 lines from the bottom. Today's Daf Yomi, we're studying in memory of Gray's brother Bobby Thomas, her mother Beverly, her grandmother Grace, and also in memory of Danny Perla's father Reuven ben Shlomo Sarah Malka, and memory of Eric's mother, Chaya Sarah Bas Reuven. So today's Daf Yomi, we take it up 15 lines from the bottom on 17b. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. Rav Huna is taught in the name of Rav. Shomeres Yavam, Shemesa Mutar Ba'ima. So what's the case that we're talking about here? So a Shomeres Yavam is, let's say there's Reuven and Shimon. There's two brothers. Reuven is married to Sarah, and now Reuven has died. So Sarah falls to Yibum with Shimon, but Shimon has not yet done Yibum with her, but he is waiting to do Yibum with her. And now, at this point, Sarah dies. So what Rav teaches is that Reuven is allowed to marry Sarah's mother, even if they had been fully married. If Shimon had been married to Sarah, then Reuven would not be allowed to marry Sarah's mother, because then Shimon would not be allowed to marry Sarah's mother, because you're not allowed to marry the mother of your wife even after your wife dies. But in this case, they weren't married. She was just Shomeres Yavam. She was waiting for Yibum. So therefore, Rav says you're allowed to get married. Must be that Rav is of the position, Alma Kasavar Ein Zika. Rav must be of the position that there's no such thing as Zika. What's Zika? Zika is a word you should remember. It means like a connection. It means that even though she falls to Yibum, even though in this case Sarah falls to Yibum with Shimon, they're not considered married. Even though that he has the rights to marry her, even as we'll see, even against her will, they're not considered married. That's the case. That Rav must say there's no Zika. Gemara said that there's nothing there. Even though he has the legal right, it's not like a betrothal, which is a formal legal right. So Gemara says, well, why doesn't he just say, so why does he have to say it in this convoluted manner? If you're the woman who's waiting for Yibum for you dies, you can marry her mother. Why doesn't he just say there's no such thing as Zika? Gemara says, if he had said there's no such thing as Zika, then I would have said, Hani Mili betray. When do we say there's no such thing as Zika? By a circumstance where the woman falls to you before two brothers, because since she can't be married to two men, that's an impossibility. Therefore, maybe there's no Zika under those circumstances. So that's what the law is. Well, the Gemara says, so then I might have thought that if he just said there's no Zika, I might have said, when is there's no Zika by two people? But when it's one person, I might have said that there is Zika in that circumstance. So the Gemara says, well, why doesn't he just say the law is like the one who says there's no Zika, even by a case of where she falls to Zika for one person, that there's still no Zika? And the Gemara says, well, if we had said that, well, then I would have said, well, even while Sarah's still alive, remember that case where we said Reuven is married to Sarah, and then Reuven dies, and then Sarah falls to Yibum with Shimon. And after she dies, Rav says Shimon can marry Sarah's mother. But if he had just said there's no Zika, even when there's only one brother, then I would have said, even while Sarah's still alive, Shimon can marry her mother. So we see from here, from Rav's statement, that you can only marry her mother after she dies if you have a Zika with her, but not while she's still alive. Why? Because there's a mitzvah of Yibum, or do either the mitzvah of Yibum or do the mitzvah of Chalitza. But if you would marry your Zika, the one who's the Shomeres Yibum with you, if you would marry her mother while she's still alive, then she's already disqualified from mitzvah of Yibum or Chalitza, and you've nullified that mitzvah, because then you're married to somebody who's related to her, and then we don't do Yibum under those circumstances. So by doing this, you've nullified the mitzvah of Yibum or Chalitza. And Rav doesn't want to say that because also of Atal Mitzvah Yivamin. So therefore, even though there's no Zika, you have to wait for the Shomeres Yavam to die before you can marry her mother. So Gemara says, Tanan, let's try and challenge Rav's position. Remember, Rav says that once the woman dies, the Shomeres Yavam dies, you can marry her mother. When we learned Yevamos, it says in the Mishnah, Yevamos Shemesa Mutar Ba'chosa. The Mishnah says if the Yevama dies, you can marry her sister. Doesn't that imply Ba'chosa in Be'ima? Well, you can only marry her sister because once your wife dies, anyway, you're allowed to marry her sister. So therefore, you can marry a sister, but her mother you can't. Ba'chosa in Be'ima. Doesn't that imply against Rav? The Gemara says no. Who didn't feel Be'ima? No, you could also marry her mother. You can also marry her mother. And since the first clause it said when your wife dies, you can marry her sister, but you can marry the sister but not the mother because because when your wife dies, it's a biblical prohibition to marry her mother. So too it also says mutar b'chosa. So also it says here, if your Yevama dies, you can't marry the mother, but you can marry the sister. That's why it says in the Sefer you can marry a sister, only because it says that in the Reisha. But also it's the same law that you're also allowed to marry the mother. Rabbi Yehuda says, so Rabbi Yehuda is going to argue with Rav. We'll see later on that Rabbi Yehuda would never really just argue with Rav straight out, but he's basing himself on Shmuel's position. So Rabbi Yehuda quotes his teacher Shmuel. Sometimes Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav, sometimes he says in the name of Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda quotes in the name of Shmuel the following position, but now he doesn't quote in the name of Shmuel. Now he says it on his own, and he argues. He says, Rabbi Yehuda said, "Shomeres Yavam Shemesa Asur Be'ima." He says, well, if you have a Shomeres Yavam, a woman who's waiting for Yibam, and she dies, you're not allowed to marry her mother. Unlike Rabbi said, you can't marry your mother. Rabbi Yehuda said you can't marry her mother. Why not? Alma Kasavar Yesh Sika. He says because there must be some connection. You must have been like you're betrothed to her already. So if that's the case, why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda just say the law is like the one who says that there's a Zika? Mar said no. If he had said that, I would have said, when is there a Zika? When there's only one person, one brother around to do Yibam Rachalitza with her, because then it could be like she's married to her. I will betray, but when there's two, then I would say Ein Zika. When there's two brothers left around, I'm going to say there's no Zika. So therefore, that's what he says. That's what he has to say like this: that Shomeres Yavam that dies, even if she was married, even if there's two brothers surviving, and we know that there's still a Zika, even though she can't marry both brothers, she still has a Zika with both of them. The Gemara says, "V'haki pligi betray pligi." But when the Mishnah argues later on whether or not there's Zika, they're arguing about a case of two. So why would we have thought that? If he just said straight out that there's a Zika, if he had said that straight out, there's a Zika, we're on top of 18a. I would have said, yeah, well, while the brother is alive, then or while she's alive, there's a Zika. But if she died, I might have thought right away you can marry her mother because Pakala Zika, the Zika dissolves on its own. No, the Zika the Zika doesn't dissolve on its own. One of the other brothers would have had to do an act like a chalitza with her, or a yibum, in order for you to marry her. In order for the other brother to marry her mother. Gemara says, let's bring a proof in support of Rabbi Yehuda again, who says that if a woman dies, you're not allowed to marry her mother. If your Shomeres Yavam dies, you can't marry her mother because you have a Zika with her. Let's bring a proof for this, because we said in the Mishnah, Yevamos Shemesa Mutar Ba'chosa. If your Yevama dies, you're allowed to marry her sister. Doesn't that imply Ba'chosa in Be'imalo? Doesn't that imply only her sister but not her mother? The Gemara says, no, who didn't that feel Be'ima? No, you're also not allowed to marry her mother. Since the first clause says, if your wife's sister dies, you can marry her sister. If your wife dies, you can marry her sister, which is Davka Ba'chosa Avol Be'imalo. There is specifically only your sister, or your wife's sister. The only case of a prohibited relationship where it can become permitted again is by your wife's sister. That if your wife dies, you can marry her sister. There, specifically in that case, you can marry your sister. Avol Be'imalo, but by a mother, if your wife If your wife dies, you can't marry the mother. Why? It's a biblical prohibition. So for that reason, Tani Nami Seifa, it says the concluding clause, mutter bachos, so that you're allowed to marry the sister. In this case of Shomeres Yavam, that's why it says in this case that if the Shomeres Yavam dies, you're allowed to marry her sister. But really, you're not allowed to marry the mother also. Hold on one second. You're allowed to marry the sister, but still you're not allowed to marry the mother. So, but it's not a proof. It's not a proof for Rabbi Yehuda because the Gemara will say it's not a proof because you could read it that it's also the mother. It's just the only reason why it mentions the sister is because of the first cause of the Mishnah. Again, the Gemara wants to challenge Rav Huna Bar Chia. So Rav Huna Bar Chia wants to challenge Rabbi Yehuda. Again, Rabbi Yehuda says there's no such thing as that the Zika is prohibited. There is a Zika. There is a connection with the Shomeres Yavam. She falls to Zika. And so therefore, you can't marry your Shomeres Yavam's mother. So Rav Huna Bar Chia challenges this because we have a case. And what's the case? Asa by Maimer. So what's this case that we're referring to here? That we're referring to the following. Referring to the following circumstance. That let's say there are Reuven and Shimon who are two brothers, and they're both alive at the same time. And then Reuven marries Sarah, and Shimon marries Rebecca. They're two totally different people. And then Reuven dies without any children. And so now Sarah falls to Yibum in front of Shimon. And then afterwards, Levi is the third brother is born. So that's the background. Also by Maimer. Then if Shimon had done Maimer with Sarah, but he had not yet fully betrothed her, he did this rabbinic betrothal, which is called Maimer, then Umeis, and then Shimon dies, then Shnia Chalatzis V'lomas Yeveamos. Then Shimon's wife does only Chalitza or Yibum. She only does Chalitza, but she cannot do Yibum with the third brother, i.e. with Levi. Why? Levi cannot marry Reuven's widow because Levi was born after Reuven died. So if Reuven's, now once Shimon dies, if Reuven's widow had fully married Shimon, then Reuven's widow, let's say Sarah, would have been prohibited to Levi always because she was the wife of a brother who he was not alive with at the same time, and also her co-wife would be prohibited. But if she didn't marry, then she would remain prohibited, but Shimon's wife would be permitted to do Yibum with Levi. So let's say she does this action, let's say Shimon does this action called Maimar, which is like a quasi-marriage. He does that with Reuven's wife, Sarah, and then he dies. So then Shimon's widow, we're saying, cannot do Yibum with Levi because maybe Shimon really had married Reuven's wife through this Yibum, through this Maimar. So we make him do Chalitza out of a doubt because we don't want to let her marry other people. Maybe it's not a valid marriage. Which doesn't that imply time in David B'Maimer? What's the reason why we say that they can't do Yibum and they have to do Chalitza? Because he did this action because Shimon did Maimer with Reuven's wife. Hello, B'Maimer, but if he would not have done Maimer, then Shnia Nami Yevume Yevame. Then, in fact, if he hadn't done Maimer, then Levi would have actually been able to do Yibum with Shimon's wife. Zika, and if you say there's such a thing as Zika, how could he do Yibum with Shimon's wife? Zika. She was the co-wife of Shimon's wife, was the co-wife of Reuven's widow through a Zika. So it must be that we don't say Zika because otherwise it wouldn't be dependent upon the Maimer, and Shimon's wife would not be able to do. Otherwise, would not be dependent upon the Zika, and Shimon's wife would not be able to do Yibum or Chalitza even at that point, or Yibum even at that point. So the Gemara says, Rabba says no. Who didn't Afaga? It's Yibum, and it does Chalitza and not Yibum with Levi. So what's the case? Shnia nichotz chaltzi yivume lo miyama. So it would be the same law that even if he didn't do Maimer, it would be the same law with respect to the second wife. She would only do Chalitza, but not Yibum. Maimer. So why does our Brisa here? Why does the Mishnah here mention Maimer? Fukimi Beis Shammai wants to exclude the position of Beis Shammai, who says the Amar Maimer Kona Kinyan Gomer, who says Maimer is completely effective. So according to Beis Shammai, once he does Maimer, then you don't even need to do, Levi wouldn't even need to do Chalitza with Shimon's wife because it's a full marriage, that Shimon really is totally married to Reuven's wife. And so therefore, not only is she exempt from Yibum, but also Shimon's wife is exempt from Yibum with Levi. We don't say that. So that's what he's saying. So Esau Abaya challenges Rabbi Huda, and remember Rabbi Huda says that there's Zika, and therefore it's prohibited to marry the mother of your Shomeres Yavam. Abai says, let's say we have Shnei Achen Ba'olam Echad. Let's say there are two brothers alive at the same time. Umei Secha Mehan below Vlad. One of them dies, no children. V'amar Hasheni Aseh Lasos Maimer B'Yevamaso. And then the second one gets up to do Maimer with, let's say, Reuven's wife, who is, let's say, Sarah. Well, he's because so it's by Maimer, and Shimon was not able to do Maimer with her until another brother was born, Umeis, and now Shimon dies. Harishona Yotza Mishum Eishes Achar Shloya B'Olamo. So Reuven's wife Sarah, she goes that she doesn't need Yibum or Chalitza because at this point there's only Levi, and Levi is her husband's brother, but they weren't alive at the same time, so Levi doesn't do Yibum. Vishnia, where Shimon's wife, Shimon's wife, Levi could do either Chalitza or Yibam with her. And if you want to say like Rabbi Yehuda says that there's Zika, then there should be a Zika, and then she should be prohibited via the Zika that Shimon had with Reuven's wife, and therefore the co-wife should be prohibited. Mar says, no, that position is Rabbi Meir. Hamani, Rabbi Meir, that Bryce is Rabbi Meir who says ain't Zika. That's the position of Rabbi Meir who says that there's no such thing as Zika. And so that's the position of Rabbi Meir who says there's no such thing as Zika. Mar says, Rabbi Meir ain't Zika. Does Rabbi Meir really say that there's no such thing as Zika? Does Rabbi Meir really say that? But we have the following case. And so, by the way, and since Rabbi Meir says there's no such thing as Zika, for that reason, then Shimon's wife in that case could do Yibum or Chalitza. So the Gemara says, does Rabbi Meir really say there's no such thing as Zika? But didn't we learn in the Mishnah? Arba Achim. Let's say there are four brothers. Shnayim and Nesu and Shtei Achios. Of these four brothers, two of these brothers, Reuven and Shimon, are married to two sisters. Let's call them Rachel and Leah. Umeisu, and then Hanesu and Achayos. And then these two men, Reuven and Shimon, died. Then the remaining two sisters, the two widows, they do chalitza with the two brothers and not yibum. And if Rameir says there's no zika, then hani mitrei batikas, and they're coming from two separate homes. Let them both do yibum with brother number 3 and number 4. Why do we force them to do chalitza? There's no zika there. We should allow them to do yibum. Gemara says, "La'olam ain zika." Gemara says, "No, really." Rameir says there is no zika there. So if that's the case, why do we force them to do chalitza? Mishum de kasavar asur levatal mitzvahs yevamin, because he's of the position that you're not allowed to nullify the mitzvah of yibum. The dilma, because we're concerned, because what's our concern there? Again, back to the same idea. We're not allowed to nullify the mitzvah of yibum, and what's our concern? Admiyabim chad. We're concerned that brother number 3, let's say Levi, is going to do yibum with the first sister, with Rachel, and then in the meantime, brother number 4 has died, and now because he did yibum with the first sister, now the second sister can't do yibum with him, so she lost out the mitzvah of yibum because he's already married to one. So therefore, in this case, we want to say do chalitza with both, so you don't lose the mitzvah of yibum. The Dilma the Miyamchan Mayasita Kabato Mitzvah Yibum. Gemara says, "Vi ain't Zika tibatel." But if there's no Zika, why do we care? Let the mitzvah be nullified. Then we have a case that Rabbi Gamliel Amar ain't Zika. That wasn't there a case where Rabbi Gamliel says there's no Zika. And since there's no Zika, you're not really getting rid of a mitzvah, so you couldn't nullify the opportunity to do the mitzvah of Yibum. It's not Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel taught. We're going to get to this case in 79b. We have a lot to look forward to. Rabbi Gamliel said, in miyana, v'mo miyana, tamtina chitagdil. Okay, what's this case? This case is where, there's two sisters, Rachel and Leah, and there's there's two brothers, and Reuben and Shimon. So Reuben is married to Leah, the older sister, and Reuben dies. And Shimon was married to Rachel, and she was young, so she could still reject the marriage. So what happened? So Rabbi Gamliel says if she rejects it, she rejects it, because he can't be married to both Rachel and Leah at the same time because they're sisters. So he said if she rejects it, it's rejected. Then but if she doesn't want to reject it, tell Rachel to wait until she grows up. And then let the second one go out because of the wife of your sister. Meaning to say, Rabbi Gamliel says we don't force her to reject it. She can grow older, and then make Leah say at that point, you're the wife of your sister, and so therefore you don't do Yibum or Chalitza. And so therefore Rabbi Gamliel doesn't say under those circumstances that we should force her to do Miyun, in order we don't nullify the mitzvah of the Rabbi Gamliel doesn't say under those circumstances that you do Yibum with Leah, so you don't lose the opportunity for mitzvah Levato or mitzvah Yibum. He doesn't say that. So we see that Rabbi Gamliel says there's no Zika because he allows the Ketana to remain, this younger girl to remain with Shimon, and we're nullifying the mitzvah of Yibum. So since Rabbi Meir also says Ein Zika, we should also say you're allowed to nullify the mitzvah of Yibum. That's the way Rashi explains it. So Amrulay, the Rabbi Gamliel, the Rabbi Meir, there are two different positions, Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Gamliel, they both say, it's true, they both say there's no Zika, but Rabbi Gamliel says you're allowed to nullify the mitzvah opportunity to do Yibum, and Rabbi Meir says you can't. So the Gemara says, no, Hachikam Rinan. Rabbi Meir Chayesh Afilu Sveika. Rabbi Meir says, so much so are we not allowed to nullify the mitzvah of Yibum that we're concerned, even if he would die, then we would lose the opportunity. Whereas in the case of Rabbi Gamliel, it's a certainty. Rabbi Gamliel Afilu Vadai, because she's certainly going to grow older. So even in a certain case of Vadai Lo Chayesh, even in a case where she's going to grow older for sure, we're also not concerned about the mitzvah, about nullifying the mitzvah of Yibum. So the Gemara says that's exactly it. So Rabbi Meir, maybe Rabbi Meir was not concerned about nullifying the mitzvah, even in a certain case, he's not concerned. And the one who is concerned, meaning to say, Rabbi Meir is concerned even in a case of doubt. Rabbi Gamliel is not concerned even in the case of certainty. So Amar Abai Rav Yosef, how do Rabbi Yehuda, that which Rabbi Yehuda says that there is a Zika, and therefore you're not allowed to marry the mother of your Shomeres Yavam. That position where he argues with Rav, who says there's no Zika, Rabbi Yehuda based it upon the position of Shmuel. The Tanakh, because what did we learn? Shmuel taught Shomeres Yavam Shakidesh Achav Esachosa, because we learned to the top of 18b, the following case. Let's say there was a Shomeres Yavam, meaning to say there was a woman who was waiting for Yibum. We had this case already back in Megillah on 18b. And then the brother of Shekidish Achev Shel Yavam, as Rashi says that the brother of the Yavam betrothed the sister of the widow after she fell to Yibum. So there's three brothers. And Reuben was married to Sarah. Reuben was, let's say, married to Rachel, and Rachel dies. And Reuben dies, and now Rachel falls to Yibum with Shimon and Levi. But before either one of them does Yibum with her, Shimon goes along and betroths Leah, who's Rachel's sister. So they say, wait until your brother does an action, meaning to say, wait until your brother. We say wait to marry her until your brother does an action, until he does Yibum with her, and therefore uproots the Zika from you. So we see that from the Zika, you're not allowed to be with her sister until she actually uproots it by having the third brother do Yibum or Chalitza with the widow. So the Amar Shmuel, Alach Rabbi Yehuda and Shmuel says that the law is like Rabbi Yehuda and we see from here that with Zika, that there is a Zika. And that's like Rav Yehuda taught. So the Gemara says, Amar le di Rav mai. So the Gemara says either Rav, and if indeed Rabbi Yehuda would say this teaching in the name of Rav, what would be so difficult? Kasha the Rav of the Rav, it would have been a difficulty because Rav Huna says that Rav says there's no Zika, and if you would say Rabbi Yehuda is saying his teaching in the name of Rav, his Rebbe, then there's a dispute because he says that there is a Zika, and Rav said before there's no Zika. That's what Rav Nuna taught. The Gemara says, but it's still possible. It's still possible that the Amoraim are arguing about what Rav is saying. That's always possible. So the Gemara says, no. So since we have an explicit teaching that where Shmuel said basically there is a thing as Zika, and we have a teaching from Rav Hamnuna said there's no Zika. We're not going to abandon the explicit teaching of Shmuel and say, oh, it's a dispute about what Rav says. We'll say that Rabbi Yehuda said his teaching in the name of Shmuel, and Rav Hamnuna said in the name of Rav. And Amar Rav Kahana said, Rav Kahana said, I said his teaching of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rav Zviv from Nardai, and meaning this teaching that there is a Zika. And Amarli Atun Hachimas Nisala, you weren't like this, that he didn't say explicitly in the name of Shmuel. It's just we are able to attribute it in the name of Shmuel. But we have it, Anam Bahedja Masnisim. We have Rabbi Yehuda saying explicitly in the name of Shmuel, because Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Shomeres Yavam Shemesa Asr Ba'amar. That Rabbi Yehuda Be'ima. That Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Shomeres Yavam Shemesa is prohibited to marry her mother. Alma Kasavar Yesh Zika, that there is this thing called Zika, that there is this connection. Well, the Shmuel time, and Shmuel follows this logic. Damar Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, who says in that case there is a Zika, you need to uproot the Zika by having the other brother do Yibum. Utricha, and we need both of these teachings, Diashmina and Yeshmika Zika, because if we just had a teaching that Shmuel says there is a Zika, Avamina Hani Mili, I would have said, well, I would have said Hani Mili Bechad, Latrelo. I said, when does Shmuel say there's a Zika? When the widow falls before one brother, but for two brothers, maybe there's no Zika there because you can't be married to two men. Kamashmon. And if we had just said the law is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, I would have said, when is the law like? When do we say that the law is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, that you have to that there's a Zika only while the Yevama is alive? But after she dies, Zika. I would have said maybe the Zika just disappears. Kamash Malan. So that's why we have the other teaching that Shomer Yom Shemesa Asura, because it's teaching us the Zika B'chtilo Baka, that the Zika doesn't disintegrate on its own. Okay, well, we'll just say this Mishnah and then we'll stop for the day. The Mishnah says, Shnei Achem Umeis Echamehen. Let's say there are two brothers and one of the brothers dies. The Yavamasheni Ateshes Achiv. So let's say there's Reuven and Shimon. And Reuven dies, and Shimon comes along and does Yibum with Reuven's wife. And then he gives, and then a third brother is born, Levi, Umeis, and then Shimon dies. Arishona Yotza Mishamei Shesacham Shalo Yabo. Vashniya Mishum Tzarasa. Okay, we'll pick this up on Shabbos. All right.